The global defense industry has long been one of the largest economic sectors in the world. In every conflict, whether regional or international, the need for military equipment continues to increase, creating a highly lucrative market for several weapon-producing countries. According to data from SIPRI, in 2022, total global expenditure reached a staggering figure of $2.24 trillion. This is the highest figure ever recorded in history and represents a 3.7% increase compared to 2021. This figure reflects how countries around the world continue to prioritize military spending. Despite facing global economic challenges such as inflation and energy supply crises, the arms trade is not a new phenomenon. Since World War II, the arms trade has been an integral part of international relations. Weapons are not only used to defend a country's sovereignty but also serve as a tool to strengthen political influence and secure economic interests. Currently, the arms trade involves more than 150 countries worldwide, with millions of units of weapons being transferred every year. Among the countries with the largest military expenditure, the United States ranks first. The country spent more than $877 billion in 2022, equivalent to 39% of total global military expenditure, making the United States a dominant player in the global defense industry. China ranks second with $292 billion, followed by Russia with $86.4 billion, India with $81.4 billion, and Saudi Arabia with $75 billion. These 5 countries collectively account for 62% of total global military expenditure, demonstrating the dominance of major countries in shaping the defense industry landscape. However, this large expenditure is not just about building defense. A significant portion of the budget is also allocated for producing and exporting weapons, creating an international arms trade worth billions of dollars every year. In this market, there are 5 countries that are the largest arms exporters in the world, namely the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and China. Together, they account for 76% of total global arms exports during the period 2018 to 2022. This dominance shows how a few countries have significant control over the distribution of weapons and military technology worldwide. The United States, as the leader of the global arms market, accounts for 40% of total global arms exports during the period. SIPRI data shows that U.S. arms exports continued to increase, rising by 14% between 2013 to 2017 and 2018 to 2022. One of the main drivers of this increase is the U.S. geopolitical strategy that utilizes arms exports as a tool to strengthen military alliances and maintain influence in various conflict regions. As the world's largest arms exporter, the United States has leveraged its defense industry to strengthen its global position. In 2022, the value of U.S. arms exports reached $51.9 billion, representing about 3.2% of the country's total exports. This figure not only reflects the large capacity of the U.S. defense industry but also shows the central role that weapons play in diplomatic relations and U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. defense industry consists of giant companies such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. These companies not only produce various types of advanced weapons, from fighter jets to missile systems, but also continuously innovate to meet the needs of modern militaries. In this context, arms exports are not just business but also a tool to influence the policies of partner countries. U.S. arms exports are often directed to strategic allies in unstable regions such as the Middle East and Eastern Europe. For example, Saudi Arabia is one of the main buyers of U.S. arms, having received various types of advanced weapons, including fighter jets and air defense systems. On the other hand, Ukraine, which is struggling against Russian invasion, has also become a major recipient of U.S. military aid since the invasion in February 2022. The U.S. government has allocated more than $113 billion in military aid to Ukraine in various forms, including weapons, ammunition, training, and logistical support. However, much of this aid is actually a loan that must be repaid in the future. Of course, U.S. dominance in the arms trade is not without controversy. Many parties have criticized U.S. arms export policies, arguing that they exacerbate conflicts in various parts of the world. For instance, U.S. arms exports to Saudi Arabia have been sharply criticized due to the country's role in the war in Yemen. The Yemen war has caused a severe crisis, with millions displaced and thousands killed. The conflict has resulted in more than 377,000 deaths, according to a 2021 UNDP report, with the majority being civilians killed in airstrikes supported by U.S. military technology. U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia are an example of how arms trade can impact global conflicts. Despite international pressure to halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. continues to pursue large-scale arms deals with the country. U.S. arms exports to Israel are also a contentious issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. U.S.-made weapons are often used in military operations that cause significant civilian casualties, prompting criticism from human rights groups that argue the U.S. indirectly supports human rights violations through its arms trade. On the other hand, supporters of U.S. arms exports argue that this policy is a legitimate tool to protect national interests and maintain global stability. For example, sending weapons to Ukraine is considered an effort to counter Russian aggression and maintain a rules-based international order. However, even in this case, criticism still arises. The reason is that U.S. military aid to Ukraine is largely provided in the form of debt, which ultimately provides significant economic benefits to the United States. The claim that military aid is a praiseworthy action actually brings significant economic benefits to the country. In many cases, aid is provided in the form of loans, where recipient countries must repay the loans with interest, creating a revenue stream for the U.S. government. Additionally, much of this aid must be used to purchase weapons and equipment from U.S. companies, creating a highly profitable economic cycle for the U.S. defense industry. Thus, the U.S. government not only profits from interest on loans but also supports domestic industry through massive orders of weapons. This means that arms aid sent abroad is actually a significant boost to the U.S. economy, particularly in the defense sector. For example, in the case of Ukraine, most of the arms aid provided by the U.S. comes from contracts with defense companies like Lockheed Martin. This model allows the U.S. to maintain its industrial dominance while expanding its influence on the world stage. By providing arms aid to its allies, the U.S. strengthens its political and military influence in regions under its influence, supporting long-term geopolitical interests. However, military aid in the form of debt often becomes a heavy burden for recipient countries, especially those with fragile economies. Ukraine, for instance, faces significant economic challenges in the midst of ongoing conflict. This creates a situation where Ukraine must allocate a large portion of its budget to repay loans for weapons, even after the conflict ends. Moreover, there is a risk that recipient countries of such aid will lose some of their sovereignty. With large debts to the United States, these countries can be forced to follow foreign policies that align with U.S. interests and make them more dependent on the U.S. defense industry. Due to ongoing conflicts around the world, many cases of conflict seem to be maintained to keep the arms trade running. As many observers have said, war has become a big business for the United States. The U.S. defense industry employs over 2.1 million workers directly and indirectly, making it one of the largest sectors in the economy. With a military budget reaching $877 billion in 2022, the United States not only leads in global arms trade but also makes this sector a main pillar of its economy. According to the annual Defense News Top 100 report, U.S. defense companies continue to dominate the list of the world's largest arms manufacturers. In 2022, the 5 largest U.S. companies, namely Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, recorded combined revenues of over $200 billion from the defense sector alone. This figure is equivalent to the GDP of several developing countries, showing the significant economic contribution of this sector. Lockheed Martin, as the largest defense company in the world, generated revenue of $66 billion in 2022, mostly from government contracts to produce F-35 fighter jets and missile systems. Then, Raytheon Technologies, known for its Patriot air defense system, recorded revenue of $67 billion in the same year. These companies not only benefit from ongoing conflicts but also from geopolitical tensions that continuously drive demand for weapons. That's why critics argue that the large scale of the US defense industry indirectly creates an incentive to maintain conflicts. In other words, war becomes a very profitable business for the United States and its allies. Military aid provided by the United States to countries like Ukraine is often framed as an effort to maintain peace and stability. However, the reality is that such aid brings significant economic benefits to the United States. For example, the Foreign Military Financing (FMF) program managed by the U.S. State Department allows allied countries to purchase U.S. weapons with loan funds. In this scheme, recipient countries are often tied to long-term contracts that require them to purchase equipment from U.S. companies. This ultimately creates economic and political dependence while providing significant financial benefits to the United States.